The story begins with a guy who was in a university dormitory called Zhang Cheng on an ordinary early rainy day. The student's name was Fan Li, and he was a first-year university student. He wasn't worried about anything, just lying in his room on the phone. Fan Li stayed in the dorm for the summer when all the other students went home and had a good time. He found several part-time jobs near the school, and at that time, he could not have imagined something like this. An inexplicable thing was heading towards the university from space, and Fan Li could not imagine that this summer his life would be turned upside down. And suddenly, after a long flight, this thing began to land in the university dormitory, flying through the open window of the room. Suddenly, an unknown blue ball flew into Fan Li's room and began to slowly roll down the floor towards the guy. Suddenly, right in front of Fan Li, this blue ball turned into some strange unknown portal, and it was an inexplicable phenomenon. Fan Li was very surprised to hear some strange sounds in his room, and turning around, noticed a strange blue glow and froze in shock. Fan Li couldn't figure out what it was and where this strange thing came from in his room because he didn't notice it landing. The student began to slowly move towards her and thought about whether it was a hologram or a wormhole, and he thought that it was some kind of nonsense. Fan Li touched this thing and thought that this couldn't be, because he could have encountered a wormhole in some novel, but not in his dorm. The student thought that he shouldn't have guessed what it was, and after that, he began to enter this portal to see for himself. And then Fan Li froze in surprise because he found himself in a different place where there were houses and all the people were going about their business. Fan Li wondered if he had moved to another dimension and thought what kind of month it was, and it looked like medieval Europe. And then a local man was minding his own business and wanted to go fishing. But suddenly he noticed a young guy, Fan Li. The local people started pointing at the guy and shouting something in their own language, and Fan Li realized that it looked like he had been caught in front of people. Fan Li didn't understand what they were talking about and thought that he would try to address them in English, since he didn't know any other languages anyway. People stared at the guy and didn't understand his language, and were shocked by this and thought that this guy was some kind of creature. Fan Li continued talking to them, but suddenly the people turned around and began to quickly run away from there in fear and scream throughout the area. Local residents ran into a nearby building and asked the man for something in their language and wanted to hide in this fortress. And then suddenly armed men started coming out of this building along with their animals, and they were very angry. Fan Li started to run away from there and thought about what these people were up to, and realized that they didn't really like guests there and seemed to be even afraid. Fan Li quickly ran through the portal back to his room and thought that he needed to get back quickly to avoid trouble. But after that, turning around, Fan Li noticed that the angry dog continued to chase him, and he realized that he needed to come up with something. Fan Li thought that he seemed to have a serious problem, and he began to think about how to deal with this evil beast. Fan Li stood in shock and thought about how he could close this damned black hole that had caused so much trouble in this short time. Fan Li didn't understand what to do and started asking for the door to be closed in all the languages existing on the planet. But it didn't work, and the dangerous beast continued to approach the student, and Fan Li didn't know what to do and just looked at this animal. Fan Li prayed for this portal to finally close, because the beast was already nearby and could cause him serious injuries. And then Fan Li began to squeeze this portal with his hands and realized that it was working, and then the portal began to slowly close. But suddenly the beast came close and almost bit the student, and Fan Li was seriously scared by this and began to shout throughout the dormitory. But Fan Li did not lose his head and continued to squeeze this portal to close it completely. And finally he managed to do it, and he was saved. And then this portal transformed into a round ball, and Fan Li looked at it and did not understand what it was because he had never seen such things before. The student continued to sit on the floor and wondered how this strange thing got to him and whether it was really a portal to another time. After this, Fan Li calmed down and went to bed. The next morning came, and the student began preparing for another busy day. Fan Li's daily schedule consisted of tutoring from 9 to 11 and improving his knowledge from an early age. After school, from 12 to 2 o'clock in the afternoon, he worked as a delivery man, and then his busy workday began. From 2 o'clock in the afternoon until 4 o'clock, Fan Li distributed leaflets and earned his pocket money in order to support himself. From 5 a.m. to 8 p.m., Fan Li worked as a delivery man. It was very difficult for the student as he worked several jobs. And finally, at almost 9 o'clock in the evening, the student returned to the dorm and was glad that after a hard day, he could take a break from all sorts of things. Fan Li was on his way home and talking to his mother on the phone. He said he was fine and doing well in his studies. Fan Li told his mother that he was fine and didn't need money, and asked her not to worry because he could pay for his own studies. Fan Li's mother was happy for her son's success and asked for forgiveness, saying that she and his father were of little use and could not help him. Mom said that his cousin studied abroad and his parents paid 500,000 a year for his studies alone, and he had to work part-time. Fan Li asked his mother to stop saying such things and said that they had already given him more opportunities than they could have done. Fan Li said that besides, the part-time jobs would be good for him, and said with a smile that at least he would have something to write on his resume after graduation. The student asked his mother not to worry about him, and asked her to take better care of herself and not worry about all sorts of unnecessary trifles. After the conversation, Fan Li thought that his parents had invested their money poorly and were now in multi-million-dollar debt. Fan Li recalled that his parents had to look for new jobs after retirement to earn extra money. The student remembered that his mother worked as a housekeeper, and he saw how much she aged in just a few months. Fan Li thought about what he could do about it, because he earned pennies from crappy part-time jobs to somehow help his parents get out of the financial hole. And then Fan Li grabbed that same round ball and said the word money 3 times and told the ball that he needed this money. But suddenly, Fan Li realized that this wormhole he held in his hand opened up access for him to the ancient Middle Ages. Fan Li thought that there must have been a lot of valuable items there, and if he started trading with the guys on the other side of the hole, he could make some serious money. The student recalled that the most common spices for them at that time were considered real luxury items, and pepper was even called black gold. Fan Li was very happy and realized that any modern consumer goods would seem to them to be some kind of wonderful and incomparable thing. And then Fan Li shouted that he would become a huckster and become very rich and would immediately buy himself an expensive car and live in a mansion. People were outraged and asked the student why he was yelling like that, and he scared them to death, and apparently, from the desire to get rich, he went crazy because it was fashionable among the youth. But Fan Li remembered that these guys from the Middle Ages were not at all friendly, and what's more, he couldn't even speak their language. The student thought for a long time and came to the conclusion that he didn't care about all this because the potential benefit justified all the risks. The student thought that since heaven had rewarded him with this wormhole, he should take full advantage of this gift. And then Fan Li came to the supermarket and bought dried meat, star anise, black pepper, and many other spices. Fan Li bought all the necessary products for future trade and thought that these products should be enough for the first time. The student thought that all he had to do was buy a field kit and immediately headed to the military store to prepare for the upcoming trip. Fan Li bought a bulletproof vest, an army knife, pepper spray, and a stun gun, and realized he was now ready for further action. But the student was very upset that he had spent almost half of his monthly salary and had very little money left. After all the shopping was done, Fan Li returned to the dorm and noticed that something strange had appeared on the surface of the round ball. Fan Li wondered what it could be, and then he pressed on this strange thing, and suddenly a strange beam began to appear from it. And suddenly this beam hit the student's head, and Fan Li closed his eyes and thought what it could be, because he felt that something was happening. And suddenly, when he opened his eyes, Fan Li held the ball in his hand and noticed a screen in front of him that looked like a hologram and thought that it was. The student noticed that it was written there that the newbie task had been completed and the goal of acquiring equipment had also been successfully accomplished. For these tasks, Fan Li received the reward of understanding the West Norman language and realized that he could now speak the language of the barbarians. Fan Li studied this device and wondered if he really had a system now, because all his actions that were performed were written there. And then suddenly the ball rolled out of Fan Li's hands, and suddenly the same portal appeared in front of the student again, and Fan Li was blinded by the brightness. Fan Li was surprised that this hole opened again by itself, and he could not understand the reason for this, and thought that it was strange. But suddenly an angry dog appeared from the portal and immediately jumped towards the student and wanted to finish him off once and for all. But Fan Li didn't lose his head, and immediately turned on the stun gun and shocked the animal to protect himself from the attack of this mad dog. After such a blow, the body of the dog fell on the student and passed out right before attacking the young Fan Li. Fan Li was surprised why this dog was there again, and immediately he had one guess that answered all the questions. After this, the student looked into this portal and realized that his guess was correct, and when this mountain closed, time in another dimension stopped. Fan Li realized that time had stopped there when he looked at the frozen people who wanted to attack him last time. After this, Fan Li completely entered this portal and immediately began to close it, turning it into its original position of a round ball. And then suddenly, Fan Li heard a voice behind him. The locals were asking him questions and asking what he was doing there. Fan Li decided that he would try to communicate with them in their language and told the local man that he had been asked this question. The resident angrily asked the student not to play the fool and said that there was no one there except him and that the question was asked specifically to him. Fan Li said that he was a merchant and came to them from the eastern lands to engage in trade, and he did not have any bad thoughts. People said that this merchant was dressed strangely and behaved very suspiciously, and they thought that he was a sorcerer. Fan Li smiled and handed the people a small bag and said that it was a small gift in honor of their acquaintance. People looked at the bag in surprise and wondered if it was black pepper, because they had never seen pepper and thought that it was loved by the rich. The man told the resident to get away from him and said that he saw everything and asked him not to pretend in front of a stranger. The man smiled and told Fan Li that he really was a merchant and said that then that explained everything. The man asked Fan Li to follow him and said that he would take him to the Lord and thought that he would be interested in his goods. After this, the man took Fan Li to some person, and the student looked at him carefully and wondered if this was their local feudal lord. Fan Li couldn't believe that the local leader looked like this, while the feudal lord was sitting on his throne next to some girl. The feudal lord sat on the throne, drinking various drinks with the girl, and behaved very strangely. He made every effort to harass the girl. Fan Li watched this in amazement and realized that the depraved descriptions of those in power during the Middle Ages were not fiction. And then suddenly a screen appeared in front of Fan Li, where there was a task to take the throne in order to become the reigning emperor and acquire a support base. Fan Li's first task was to conquer this settlement of Angelinia, and he was very surprised by such a task at the initial stage. It was written there that the punishment for failure was to be the death of the owner, and he froze in shock after reading this. Fan Li thought that as soon as he dropped in to visit the local feudal lord, the system immediately demanded that he take the throne, and he wondered where such high stakes came from. Fan Li dreamed that this system would close sooner, because if people saw it, it would immediately end for him, and he was afraid of this. And then suddenly, the resident looked at him and asked what he had just done, and asked if it was really customary to greet him like that in his country. Fan Li was very surprised and turned around and asked the resident if he hadn't noticed anything, and the man asked what he had been telling him all this time. Fan Li said that he didn't say anything and thought that it was great because he realized that only he could see this system. Fan Li was very angry and thought how he could come to terms with the fact that there was such a punishment as the death of the owner. Fan Li thought that he didn't want to become any kind of ruling emperor, and he just needed to earn some money. After all, he had no goal of ruling anyone, and he was not interested in it because he was an ordinary, peaceful guy and wanted to live a quiet life without headaches. Fan Li first wanted to see if he could make any money there today, and if he couldn't do that, he wanted to crush the ball under a hydraulic press. Fan Li approached the Lord and said that he was a merchant from the eastern lands and had come to trade spices. The student said that these spices were carefully grown by the best farmers in their country and were of the highest quality. Fan Li said that the greatest magicians enchanted these spices in packages so that the spices would not lose their flavor for a long time. Fan Li said that the room where they were kept was filled with music from famous musicians to maintain an atmosphere of well-being. Fan Li confidently said that it was better than any spice they had ever tasted before that day, and they were very lucky. Fan Li took out a bag of spices and said that it was a sample and asked the feudal lord to look at these wonderful spices. The feudal lord listened to Fan Li and then suddenly stood up from his throne and leaned towards him. And it was very strange. And then all the residents sitting there started laughing and saying that their leader was the best at making jokes about inexperienced and young guests. The feudal lord asked Fan Li if this was the custom in his country to greet each other and said that it was simply hilarious. The chief told Fan Li that they had different customs there and ordered him to kneel and learn to address the local lord. The leader smiled and asked Fan Li what he had just spoken about and what he had come to bring. The leader asked if he had really approached him with his spices, and then the head looked menacingly at Fan Li and said that in that case he could leave all the spices there and quickly get out of there. And then Fan Li realized that these barbarians mistook politeness for weakness and couldn't be spoken to like that. The student wondered how he could put this savage in his place. Fan Li looked at the chief and said that he had listened to him well, and asked if he really wanted to take his spices from him by force. Fan Li threateningly told the leader that their trading camp was 200 meters from there, and asked if he wanted to threaten them too, and said that they could drown his city in blood. And then suddenly the head acted as if he was very scared by these words, and said that this could not be, and he was very scared by this. And then suddenly all the residents sitting there started laughing even harder and said that the leader had no equal in mocking people. The leader began to approach him and said that Fan Li considered himself a daring guy and said that he was eager to see what else their trading camp was rich in. Fan Li realized that the leader didn't fall for this bluff and thought that he was also good and that he initially wanted to scare the lion with meat. Fan Li began to slowly take out his knife, and at that moment, the leader came very close to him and suddenly took out his sword and swung it. Fan Li didn't have time to get his knife out, and the leader quickly pointed the sword at his neck and said that Fan Li was very slow, and it was immediately obvious that he was a greenhorn. And then suddenly, the leader took a club out of Fan Li's pocket and asked him what kind of weapon it was that he carried with him for the attack. The leader smiled and hit Fan Li on the leg and asked if it was really a toy club for children, since it did not cause any damage. And then suddenly a man started moving quickly towards them and asked them to stop doing this and asked everyone to calm down. The man asked the chief why he treated Fan Li like that and said that the merchants had a difficult job and if they treated them like that, they would stop trading with them. The man approached Fan Li and asked him to ignore the chief, saying he was drunk and handing him his club. The man asked him if he was injured, and then suddenly a man approached this man and called him my lord and asked for permission to carry out some task in this place. Fan Li froze in surprise and wondered if this man was really my lord and asked him if he was really the local feudal lord. The man was indeed the feudal lord of the city of Angelinia, and his name was Lord Tamati, and he enjoyed authority among the entire population and everyone respected him. Fan Li was surprised and asked Tamati why the man was sitting on the throne, and Tamati said that it was just a big chair and he could sit on it if he liked. And then a man came up to him and told the Lord that, with all due respect, these mercenaries had become extremely insolent, and if they continued to run things there, it would lead to serious trouble. Tamati listened carefully to his man's words, and getting angry, asked if they couldn't do without them if they behaved like that. Tamati looked at Fan Li and asked if he meant spices if he was not mistaken, and asked to show him these wonderful spices. After that, they sat down at the table, and Tamati told the student that he had spices for every taste, and he saw some of them for the first time, and taking a star anise in his hands, asked what it was. Tamati looked closely at the ingredient, and Fan Li said that it was star anise, and it was an indispensable ingredient when stewing meat. Tamati said that Fan Li's spices were excellent, and he was delighted with his goods and was eager to buy them quickly. And then a man came up to them and told my lord that he had weighed everything, and there were 5 pounds of net weight and only 6 types of spices of the highest quality. The head of Tamati said that for 5 pounds, he usually paid 35 notes, but added that for Fan Li's spices, he did not mind shelling out all 40 notes. Tamati handed Fan Li a bag of money and asked him to count it. Fan Li thought he'd never heard of their currency before, and the main thing was that he could sell it later. But suddenly, opening the bag, Fan Li was shocked because he saw a lot of gold there and thought that it was wonderful, and he was simply worried. Fan Li began to bite these coins and thought that such pure gold was undoubtedly valuable in any dimension, and this time he was very lucky. The student realized that overall he could consider this foray a success, because even though they were barbarians, it was possible to do business with them. Tamati asked Fan Li if he had counted the coins to the end and if there was an exact number of coins, and Fan Li said that everything was correct. The girl started to wake the student up, and Tamati said that he must be very tired from the journey and asked if he would rest in their area. Tamati remembered and said that he still didn't know his name, and the student said that his name was Fan Li and was perplexed by what that girl was doing there. Tamati thought about the name of the student and asked a girl named Nia to take care of Mr. Fan Li, and she immediately agreed with the head. The girl started to drag him somewhere to the side, and Fan Li did not understand anything and asked Tamati what was happening there and demanded an explanation. The boys from these parts quietly watched them and realized that it was Nia, and she was leading them to serve a visiting merchant who had recently come to their region. And then the boys joyfully ran after them and said that they would soon see the show with their own eyes because they had been waiting for it for so long. And then the man asked Nia if she really had a new friend and asked when it would be his turn, because he had been dreaming about this for many years. Nia turned to the local resident and said that he could not expect this, and said that this will not happen in this life and not even in the next. After that, Nia quickly pushed Fan Li into some building and immediately closed the door in front of her. Fan Li couldn't understand what was going on there. All the boys quickly ran there and asked everyone to get ready and said that the long-awaited show was about to begin. Nia asked the guy not to worry and said that she would not hurt him and would just play with him and he should just sit and do nothing and enjoy. After they played, Fan Li fell asleep there, and then he began to slowly wake up, and Nia came up to him and asked if he had finally woken up. Nia said that Lord Tamati had just come to them, and he had brought food for him, and asked him to get up and eat while nothing got cold. Fan Li thanked Nia and began to eat, because after all this time he was very hungry, and Nia began to cook the dish over the fire. Fan Li remembered that last night he didn't hold back at all, because it was not for nothing that they said that even heroes found it difficult to resist the charms of a beauty. And Fan Li was an ordinary guy, and he was happy to play with such a beautiful girl like Nia, because besides, she was very kind. Fan Li asked Nia if their lord treated all the merchants so well, and said that it was a pleasure to do business with him, and he paid generously for his spices. Fan Li said that the lord also brought him breakfast, and he even felt a little awkward from being treated so politely. Nia asked Fan Li to relax, and said that Lord Tamati was a very unusual ruler, and he could not worry about such pleasant treatment. Nia said that Tamati was very fair, and he led a very modest lifestyle, and in a normal situation, he would never have spent such a sum on spices. But she said that recently their districts were full of robbers, and merchants avoided them, and he treated him this way because he hoped to continue doing business with him. Nia said that Tamati was also very sensitive to his reputation, and he could be called a man of his word and honor, and Fan Li could be calm. Fan Li thought that Tamati could become a permanent partner, but he did not understand why the system demanded that he be dethroned, and he thought of choosing another place. But suddenly the system told Fan Li that the owner did not have the authority to perform this action, and he was unable to do it. Fan Li realized that he was taken hostage, because whether a person was good or bad, he still had to eliminate anyone the system indicated. And then Fan Li and Nia suddenly heard some sounds outside, and the student was very surprised and wondered what was going on there that caused such a fuss. They went outside and saw that everyone was getting ready for something, and the man told everyone that they had just been attacked, and they should prepare for retaliation. Fan Li was very surprised by these words, and said that he would go there now and see what was really going on. Nia wanted to go with him, but the man came up to them and said that, and told all the women to stay inside and lock the doors and the rest to follow him. And then Fan Li picked up the pepper spray and handed it to Nia. He told her that if anyone approached her, she should just spray it in their face. Fan Li asked Nia to stay there and not go anywhere. He promised that he would return for her very soon and asked her to take care of herself. Fan Li approached the tower, and people were saying that the bandits had gone completely crazy and that this was just a bunch of wanderers who would leave there after getting what they needed. The bandits stood at the gate and told Lord Tamati that they had simple demands and asked him to give them some grain so that they could survive the winter. But the robbers asked to give them some gold in addition to the grain, and they also wanted to update their clothes because they were tired of wearing stinking old clothes. And then one of them shouted that they also wanted women, and they didn't want to leave there without them, and asked who then was supposed to warm their beds. But one of them asked his accomplice where they got so many women from. And the robber said that it didn't matter because they wanted to take all the women. Lord Tamati climbed the tower and became very angry and thought that these robbers were beasts and something had to be done with them because they had completely lost their fear. Tamati told the robbers that they were freaks and asked them not to even hope to leave there that day with the loot and said that they would get nothing. And then Lord Tamati asked his warriors to listen to him and ordered them to take their weapons and climb the wall to prepare for battle with these freaks. But then, when all the residents were preparing for battle, they noticed that the robbers began to retreat from there and wondered if they had really gotten scared so quickly. But one of the robbers looked in their direction and smiled slyly at the warriors, and the residents realized that this was not a good sign, and they were clearly plotting something. Fan Li said that it seemed like they were waiting for something, and thought that they were waiting for reinforcements to attack their city and catch them off guard. The robber smiled and said that everything was about to begin soon, and added that this night was supposed to be hot and unforgettable for all people. And then suddenly one of the soldiers started running towards the wall and raised the alarm and shouted that a fire had started and the barn was all on fire. The head of Tamati could not believe it, and turning around, he personally confirmed that this barn was indeed on fire, and all the people ran there and tried to put out the fire. The head of Tamati was very surprised by this, and thought about why this happened right now, and realized that this fire was not an accident, and the robbers were involved in it. And then the resident informed the Lord that the robbers had gone on the offensive and said that they had to quickly move on to counterattacks. And then bandits on horseback started running towards them. There were a lot of them, and they were all armed and prepared for attack. The robber ordered his boys to grab everything they could take, including gold, the belongings of these residents, and all their beloved women. All the robbers agreed with their leader and said that they would go to the end and would not leave these pathetic people anything for their future provision and would finish them all off. Fan Li looked at all this and wondered if they really had their own people in the city who helped them get inside and suggested spare entrances. Fan Li realized that he had a bad feeling and he needed to get out of there immediately because he could easily die in this massacre. The head of Tamati looked at the actions of his enemies and ordered Morgan to take people to put out the fire, and Morgan immediately agreed with the Malad and said that they would quickly put out the fire. The head of Tamati ordered the rest of the people to defend the city and not retreat, and said that they were just a bunch of vagabonds, and they would regret that they came to them with a sword. At that moment, the same resident who threatened Fan Li stood in front of the bandits, and all the bandits were waiting for his command to begin the attack and destroy everyone. The man looked at the situation in the city and immediately gave the command to the robbers that they could go on a stealthy attack and mislead all the people. And then a resident came to the warrior and said that apparently he was one of the mercenaries hired by the Lord, and asked him not to worry and said that all the gates were well fortified. The resident said that these bastards would not break through to them so easily and asked him to go to the wall and help the rest of the warriors defend their city. The warrior said that he was already running there and said that he was already running there and he came here to check out the situation, and behind him a man with a knife in his hand began to approach. They were traitors, and they quickly finished off the local resident when their partner distracted him with his stories about how he defended this city with all his heart. The warrior noticed this and ran up to the milord, saying that the bandits had already broken through the gate. The head of Tamati wondered how this was possible. And suddenly turning around, Tamati noticed that the mercenaries were destroying all his warriors on the roof and attacking them from behind and caught them by surprise. Tamati didn't understand what was happening there and was shocked that they were being attacked by mercenaries whom they themselves hired to defend the city. And then, suddenly, someone called out to Milord and grabbed him by the shoulder. It was the same mercenary who had clashed with Fan Li. Tamati was shocked by his behavior. The mercenary thanked Tamati for the generous payment for their services and said that he was forced to inform him that their cooperation was over. The head of Tamati could not understand what this mercenary was talking about, and suddenly he dealt a fatal blow to the head from behind with his sword and said that his time had come to an end. After this, all the gates opened, and mercenaries immediately ran in on horses and ordered all their people to deal with all this cattle and not to spare anyone. The robbers left no chance for the residents, and they could no longer resist the enemies because there were many more of them, and they were all armed, and thanks to betrayal, they defeated them. Fan Li watched all this and thought that he knew that trouble was to be expected from these mercenaries, and his intuition did not fail him this time either. Meanwhile, the robbers started using arrows and began to destroy everyone with hundreds of arrows fired, and the residents could no longer defend themselves in any way. Fan Li watched this carnage and realized that it was impossible to stay there, and he often imagined himself in the image of a brave general rushing into battle. But finding himself in such a situation, Fan Li could barely escape from there and could not understand why his legs had become so weak, and he realized that in this life, there was nothing more important than life itself. And then Fan Li quickly reached the barn and thought that he needed to get out of there quickly, and he started calling Nia. But she didn't respond to his call. Fan Li couldn't understand where she could have gone, because he asked her not to go anywhere and stay there to avoid getting into trouble. Fan Li realized that he had nothing to do and would have to quickly get out of there without her, since he did not have time to look for her at such a moment. Fan Li opened a portal and just wanted to escape from there, but suddenly he heard the voice of a girl who asked him to let her go, and he realized that it was Nia. The robber pestered her and said that he could not think that in such a wretched place one could find such a beautiful lady like her, and did not want to let her go anywhere. And then suddenly the villain began to attack her and asked her not to resist him, and he wanted her to be only with him and to go with him to distant lands. Fan Li watched all this and thought that this freak still did not want to let poor Nia go because she resisted him and begged him to let her go. The villain continued to harass Nia and told her that she was just fire and said that he was very lucky this time and he found a real treasure. Nia didn't lose her composure and immediately sprayed the villain with pepper spray and said that he could taste it better and said that he would like it. The villain immediately began to writhe in pain and said that his eyes hurt a lot and he could not see anything, and Nia began to quickly break free from his embrace. The robber called Nia a witch and asked what she did to him, and Fan Li asked her to quickly come to him using this opportunity. Nia was happy to see the student and started running towards him, and suddenly the villain told her to stand, and without looking threw a spear at her and hit the target. Fan Li was shocked by this and ran up to Nia and asked her to hold on and just not die, but she told him to leave her there and quickly get out of there. And then suddenly, the robber took aim at Fan Li and threw an arrow at him and hit him right in the stomach, and he immediately fell to the ground from such a blow. But fortunately, he hit Fan Li's bulletproof vest, but he was still in a lot of pain, and he realized that it was very difficult for him to breathe because it was a strong shot. And then all the villains gathered in front of Fan Li, and their accomplice said that some witch blinded him with a strange thing, and he still couldn't see anything. The robber asked his men if he had hit the impudent boy and if he had died, but they said that he seemed to be unharmed and alive, and he asked them to finish off the impudent fellow. And then Fan Li ran into the neighboring building, and the villains were surprised and said that this guy was stupid after all, who was hiding in the wooden hut, and said that they would burn this barn down. Fan Li quickly entered the barn and locked himself in. He didn't lose his composure and, opening a portal, quickly ran inside to escape those scoundrels. But suddenly, when Fan Li found himself in his room, he tripped over a dog lying there and fell to the floor and could not get up for several seconds. Fan Li was in a lot of pain, and he thought that he had completely forgotten about this animal, and then he took the dog in his arms and threw it back to the Middle Ages. After this, Fan Li began to quickly close the portal to avoid running into trouble with this crazy gang of robbers and avoid other problems. After this, Fan Li finally sat down on a chair and was able to calm down after such unexpected events that happened to him in one day. Fan Li thought that he shouldn't go back there anymore, because coming there again meant that he was ready for certain death. Fan Li was very sad, and he thought that he would never see Nia again, because she was his first girlfriend. The student thought that the system could not require him to complete a task in another dimension while he himself was in this world. Fan Li thought that it was like in the game, because it was impossible to fail a mission without opening the game, and what claims could there be against him? Fan Li thought that he would consider it all a nightmare, because in the end, he did not lose anything and was able to meet his love. And then suddenly a system appeared before him, where his task was still to take the throne, and the punishment for failure was the death of the owner. And then suddenly a message appeared that Fan Li had 48 Earth hours left to complete the task. And suddenly a timer appeared in front of him. Fan Li was very surprised about the punishment for failure and wondered if it was possible to find out more specifically about this punishment. But then suddenly a notification appeared that more detailed information was unavailable, and Fan Li wondered if he really only had 48 hours left to live. The student was very scared by this and wondered what kind of joke this was and what right this ball had to take other people's lives. Fan Li realized that first, he needed to calm down, and he had to pull himself together and think about his next plan of action. And then Fan Li remembered the words of his great leader that no power could resist a gun to the temple, and he could only complete the task with brute force. Fan Li thought that Lord Tamati was already dead, and now Angelinia had no ruler, and he just needed to defeat the bandits and mercenaries. And then the power itself would have ended up in the hands of Fan Li, but he thought how he could defeat them all and where he could get weapons to resist. In their country, firearms were completely banned, and he couldn't get them even on the black market. But he thought maybe he could buy a gun abroad. But the student realized that he wouldn't be able to do this because he didn't have time to fly somewhere, and even having taken out the gun, he wasn't sure that he could shoot at a person. And then suddenly the student had an idea, and he started looking for the information he needed on the internet and thought that this was the only solution. The next day, the first thing Fan Li did was go to the bank to exchange the gold money for normal money so he could spend it. The bank teller told Mr. Li that at the current price of gold, he could get 90,000 yuan and said that the entire amount had already been deposited into his account. Then the student found a car repair shop on the outskirts of the city because he strictly followed his plan, and in the end, everything should work out for him. Fan Li went inside and handed the worker a flash drive and said that he needed him to do this, and that the matter was urgent and the result was needed tomorrow. The worker inserted the flash drive into the computer and was very surprised. He asked Fan Li if he had really watched too many zombie apocalypse movies. The worker asked the student what he was going to do with such a thing, but he said that his drawings were funny and he liked it. Fan Li said that it was filming equipment and he was a novice director and he needed it for his new film. The worker said that now everything became clear to him and said that he doubted that it should have been ready tomorrow because it was difficult to do. Fan Li said that he paid 30,000 and that was only for the work, and he paid for the materials separately and gave the money in advance, but everything had to be done quickly and reliably. The worker was shocked by this because it was a huge amount of money and no one had ever paid him such a sum before. And then he tried to do everything in a short time. After this, the student went to the market and chose a suitable car for himself so that the mechanic could carry out all his plans regarding this car. And almost all the remaining time, Fan Li helped the mechanic with his own order so that she could have time to complete everything and not fail the task. And after a lot of hard work and wasted time, fortunately for the student, they managed to change the car beyond recognition in time so that it would be according to plan. The worker himself was happy and said that every guy should at least once dream of a doomsday machine, and they finally completed this task. And finally, the cool apocalypse machine was ready, and the mechanic said that it was the perfect device for crazy violence like in the movies. The mechanic said he replaced the engine and reinforced the body, balanced everything, and said there shouldn't be any problems while driving. The mechanic said that Fan Li would have to call a tow truck because it was impossible to drive around the city in such a car, but the student said that he did not have time for this and grabbed the keys. Fan Li immediately left there, and the mechanic ran after him and said that the bastard had already left and asked him not to mention his auto repair shop if he was caught. At that time, the inspector was writing a ticket to someone, and he immediately left the store and asked the inspector not to do this. The man smiled and told the commander that it was already night outside, and he had literally gone into the store for 5 minutes to buy groceries and asked if he could forgive him this time. The inspector said that he wasn't interested in the time and that 5 minutes was also considered time, and he gave him a fine of 5 yuan and -3 points. But then suddenly, Fan Li drove his car past the inspector at top speed. The inspector froze in surprise. The man also looked at this car and could not understand what it was. And the inspector was also perplexed and thought that the offender needed to be caught right away. The inspector immediately mounted his motorcycle and chased Fan Li's car. The inspector ordered the student to immediately pull over to the side of the road and stop the car. And then Fan Li realized that he was in trouble, and he pressed the gas pedal all the way and quickly disappeared from this persistent inspector. The inspector realized that this was a homemade vehicle that did not meet any safety requirements, and that it was a dangerous car. The inspector realized that this strange vehicle posed a danger to both people and city property and needed to be disposed of quickly. At this time, Fan Li hid in a place where construction work was underway, and having opened a portal there, was about to set off on his journey and thought that the moment of truth was near. At the same time, in another dimension, mercenaries burned down the barn and it continued to blaze with flames, and the villains thought that for some reason, the impudent boy had now gone silent. The bandits were hoping to hear Fan Li's sweet squeal and thought that it looked like this weakling had immediately suffocated and gone to the next world. But suddenly they heard some kind of rumble in the barn and wondered what those sounds were, because they had previously realized that there was no one there. But then suddenly Fan Li appeared in front of them in his apocalypse machine and began to move towards these scoundrels to take revenge on them. The mercenaries froze in surprise and could not understand what it was because they had never seen anything like it before, and it seemed like magic. Fan Li began to mercilessly attack all the villains with his special machine, and people could not cope with the equipment and did not know what to do next. The mercenary who had been pestering Nia lay on the ground in pain. He wondered what kind of hellish creature it was that felt no pain. Fan Li started approaching him in a car, and the mercenary asked what kind of monster it was and asked him not to approach it. But then suddenly Fan Li quickly dealt with this mercenary and sent him to the next world, and he screamed in pain and could no longer resist. The remaining robbers saw the body of their accomplice and, very frightened, began to run away from there and ask for help from the heavenly powers to save them. Fan Li sat in the car and thought about whether he had really finished off this mercenary in such a brutal way, and he just couldn't get it out of his head. But Fan Li decided that he shouldn't think about him, because first of all, he needed to save Nia, because she was seriously injured by this scoundrel. Fan Li opened the door and was about to get out of the car, but suddenly he saw all this horror and immediately he vomited from this because the sharp smell of blood hit his nose. And then Fan Li quickly ran to Nia and asked her to hold on and said that he would save her now. Nia had almost lost consciousness, but she recognized Mr. Fan Li. Fan Li looked at her and realized that the wound was very serious, and without modern medicine, Nia would not have been able to survive in such conditions. And first, Fan Li took a fire extinguisher out of the trunk and put out the fire so that it wouldn't spread to neighboring buildings and incinerate the entire city. After this, Fan Li took Nia in his arms and asked her to be patient for a little while, and opening a portal, began to move towards it to save the life of an innocent girl. And when Fan Li passed through the portal, Nia was very surprised and asked the gentleman where they were, but the student said that later he would answer all her questions. Fan Li carefully laid Nia on his bed and asked her to wait for him there for a while, and said that very soon he would return for her and help her. Fan Li went back to the Middle Ages and looked at the timer and noticed that he only had 12 Earth minutes left, and that was very little. Fan Li realized that if you collapse a wormhole after moving to another dimension, time in his dimension also stops. At this time, the mercenaries tied up all the inhabitants of the city and carried them to be sold as slaves. And the trader told Morgan that he could get rich just by selling slaves. The trader told Morgan that he knew his name and that he was a strong warrior, and he offered Morgan to work for him to earn money for himself. But suddenly Morgan approached the mercenary and spat in his face and said that he would never work for such a lying rat like him who did not know what honor meant. Morgan called him a traitor and asked him to finish him off right away, and said that otherwise he would come back for him in the future to take revenge on him for all this. The traitor wiped his face and called Morgan a fool and asked if he was so eager to die that he did such idiotic things. The traitor immediately took out his sword and told Morgan that he would immediately fulfill his wish and quickly send him to the next world to his leader Tamati. But suddenly the mercenary asked his boss to look there and said that he did not understand what was happening there, and there was a strange creature standing there. And then suddenly, Fan Li drove up to them and turned on his headlights to attract the attention of these scoundrels who didn't care about other people's lives. The robber was surprised and asked the mercenary what it was, because it looked very ominous and made people afraid of it. The mercenary asked how these villagers could come up with something scary and thought that they probably built this thing to scare children. The mercenary ordered his men to quickly go there and pull out whoever was operating this thing so that he could deal with this troublemaker himself. And then Fan Li blinded them with his headlight and then began to quickly move towards them to deal with them all. Fan Li began to quickly smash them all, as no one at that time knew how to deal with such a previously unknown destruction machine, and everyone was in shock. The traitor mercenary looked at all this and could not believe his eyes, because his men were armed with swords and shields, but they could do nothing against this monster. But then the mercenary ordered his men to build a wall of shields for defense, and they immediately carried out the order and told everyone to hold the line. At this time, Fan Li remembered the mechanic's words about how he gave him a powerful engine with maximum displacement and torque, and made it sophisticated. The mechanic asked Fan Li to take into account that this was not some kind of beautiful dummy, and said that this monster could even drive through a wall and it would not be difficult. Suddenly, Fan Li began moving towards the wall at great speed and was confident that he would succeed because his drawing was completed without errors. The mercenary was very surprised and did not know what kind of hellish monster it was, because even a thoroughbred horse could not develop such a speed, and this was unexpected. Fan Li rode along this wall and easily destroyed the enemy's plans and left them no chance for further defense because he was invulnerable in this monster. The mercenary bandit and Morgan froze in surprise and could not understand what kind of monster was that could single-handedly defeat armies in battles. The mercenaries were shocked and said that this power was not from this world, and this was a chariot from the underworld, and their actions enraged the gods themselves. The mercenary told his boss that demons from hell had come to personally punish them for their sinful deeds and asked him to quickly escape from there. The robber agreed with the mercenary's words and said that he too could no longer stay there because it would not lead to anything good and was going to leave from there. But the mercenary stopped him and asked if he had really decided to just up and run away, because they had been hatching this plan for a very long time, and on the threshold of success, he wanted to give up everything. The robber asked what else they could do, since this was a chariot of demons from hell or even worse, and asked if he really wanted to wait there for his death. The mercenary told him that everything was clear with him, and he turned out to be a simple coward and said that he knew that people like them had to plow the land of the feudal lords. The robber thought and told him that if he wanted to die there, he was glad to keep him company and was no longer afraid of this monster and was ready for the fight. But he asked the mercenary to take back his words that he was a coward, but suddenly the mercenary asked him to look at the one who was sitting on this monster. The traitor mercenary smiled and said that moreover he might not believe him, but he knew the one who controlled this monster, because they had recently crossed paths with him. The bandit looked at the monster and agreed with the mercenary. He said that now they knew exactly who stood in the way of their success and began to take aim at Fan Li's car. And suddenly the robber immediately shot an arrow at the mirror of Fan Li's car and thought that this would definitely be a fatal blow to this monster. But to their surprise, the arrow hit the glass and unexpectedly flew off. They couldn't figure out what kind of monster it was that swords and arrows didn't work on. Fan Li remembered that he asked the mechanic to install bulletproof glass for him, but the mechanic asked him if he knew how expensive it was. The mechanic poured himself some water and said that installing such glass would also take some time, which, as he said, they had very little of, and therefore it was difficult to do. Fan Li asked the mechanic if there was anything he could do and said that any part of the car had to be able to withstand a weapon strike. The mechanic said that it was possible to stick on a protective film, and with it the glass could withstand a lot, even a bullet, and he said that for its safety, he could stick on several layers. The mechanic told Fan Li that this film was cheap and asked how many layers he wanted, and Fan Li suddenly said that since it was cheap, he wanted 50 layers. The robber was shocked when he saw this and asked the mercenary if he had seen it, and said that he was protected by an invisible barrier and it was definitely an otherworldly creature. He asked the mercenary what he was suggesting he do now, but turning around, he suddenly noticed that the mercenary had already managed to escape from there. The robber said that this scoundrel was a brute, and he himself immediately ran away from there, all the while calling him a coward and a weak soldier. The robber immediately began to quickly leave from there and suddenly turned around and noticed that Fan Li on his monster was chasing him and almost caught up with him. But suddenly Fan Li honked at him, which startled the horse and knocked him to the ground. The robber was surprised that the animal could even make such sounds. He lay on the ground and was very surprised to hear this roar and thought that it was something other than the roar of demons, and all his people were also very scared of this. And then suddenly Morgan fell to his knees and asked the merciful God to help them achieve justice and help them in such a difficult moment. Morgan asked God to send these dishonest robbers straight to hell, and he wanted them to burn there for their sins forever and suffer as they are now. And then suddenly, the scoundrel began to cry and said that he had turned onto this sinful path, not of his own free will, because before that he had been an honest farmer, but life had forced him to become a robber. And then Fan Li opened the car door, and Morgan said that their prayers were answered so quickly, and their God revealed himself, and he was grateful to him for that. But to their surprise, Fan Li got out of the car, calling the residents cretins and asking them to stop kneeling and take up arms and fight back against these bandits. Morgan was very surprised by this and realized that it was Mr. Fan Li and he was their savior. He thought that their lord had appeared to them in the guise of a merchant and helped them defeat the villains. Morgan was immediately inspired by this and ordered all his men to follow him and said that they would not let these scoundrels escape from there and would help Fan Li defeat them. And then suddenly, all the warriors started running towards the enemies with weapons, and Morgan ordered all the warriors not to spare these scoundrels and to teach them a lesson once and for all. Suddenly, all the warriors gained strength and began to defeat these robbers. And Morgan stood at their head and gave tips to everyone in order to achieve victory. And then suddenly all the scoundrels began to retreat from there, and Morgan ordered his warriors to shoot at these cowards who were only pretending to be strong invaders. After this, Morgan approached the body of the respected head of Tamati and told my lord that Mr. Fan Li saved them all and also saved this city from terror and invaders. Morgan told my lord that Fan Li was the incarnation of the Lord on earth, and he, riding on his chariot, brought terror to the enemies, and they quickly fled from there, afraid of him. Tamati was still alive and called Fan Li to him and told him that he wanted to tell him something and asked him not to interrupt him and listen to his last words. Tamati told Fan Li that he couldn't thank him enough for what he did for Angelina, but he still had one more request for him. The head of Tamati told the student that after his death, he wanted him to become the ruler of these lands and continue the work that he left unfinished. Tamati said that he was a weak ruler and allowed the enemies to plot right under his nose and did not prevent it in time and allowed them to attack the city. Tamati told Fan Li that if he honored Angelina with his rule, these lands would prosper like never before because he had great faith in its potential. Tamati asked Fan Li to promise him this and said that otherwise his subjects would not have been able to survive until spring, and he had already saved all these people and asked them not to abandon them to their fate. Fan Li hoped that they truly considered him a god in the flesh, otherwise they might not accept the stranger, but first he needed to complete the task and stay alive. Fan Li looked at the leader and said that he promised him this, and immediately Tamati calmed down and said that now he could die peacefully and closed his eyes. Tamati told Morgan and Hoya that they had to serve Lord Fan Li faithfully and protect this land so that their children would live in joy and not know sorrow. Tamati told Fan Li that from today on, he handed over Angelina to him and asked him to manage the city wisely and always protect his people from evil conquerors. And immediately after these words, Tamati lost consciousness and left this world forever. All the inhabitants felt very sorry for the milord, for they loved him very much and respected him as a ruler. And then suddenly a system appeared in front of Fan Li, which said that the task of seizing the throne was completed and he escaped punishment. Fan Li received a congratulatory message and became the ruler of his first lands, and the first stage of becoming a great emperor was completed. And for this, he was awarded a reward for completing the task, and a new map function was opened, as well as a treasure hunt function was opened. Fan Li couldn't understand all these new functions, and suddenly Hoi shouted that now Fan Li was their new lord, and they had to obey and respect him. And then all the residents bowed to Lord Fan Li and said that their new leader was a hero, and he saved them all when they thought there was no hope left. And then Hoi approached Fan Li and told the lord that from now on he would serve him and asked what his first order as head should be. Fan Li thought and said that first they needed to put everything in order there, because after this massacre, all the buildings there were destroyed. Fan Li ordered Morgan to bury all the fallen heroes and pile up the bodies of the bandits and dispose of them on a pyre so that they would no longer be remembered. Milord asked Hoi to calculate all their losses so that they could buy food as quickly as possible and gradually return to their previous peaceful life. Morgan told my lord that he had to tell him bad news and said that because of the fire that had started in the barn, almost all of their grain had been burned to the ground. Morgan said that on Tamati's orders, he took people and went to put out the fire, but when they arrived, it was already too late and all their winter supplies had burned up. The residents were shocked to hear this news and asked how they could survive the winter now that they had died of hunger, and they began to panic. And then suddenly, Milord Fan Li told all the residents to calm down and said that there were no unsolvable problems in the world and they just had to not lose hope. Fan Li asked them not to panic and said that he would take care of the food issue and promised them that they would never go hungry. And finally, Fan Li told the residents that if they understood him, they could now get to work so that they could quickly recover and begin to act. Hoya thought that they lacked exactly this kind of leader and thought about Fan Li's words that he would not leave them to starve and realized that Tamati made a wise choice. Hoya asked the milord what they could do with the prisoners, and Fan Li asked if there was a dungeon in Angelina and told him to throw them there for now. Koi told the lord that he did not have to worry about grain and said that Tamati was a very economical ruler, and before his death, he managed to accumulate a solid fortune. Hoya said that with this money they could last until winter, and Fan Li was interested, and he asked Hoya what amount he had in mind. Hoya asked the milord to follow him and said that he would now show him everything and led him to some building where there were many chests. And suddenly, when Hoya opened one of these chests, Fan Li was very surprised and speechless because there he saw a chest full of gold coins. Koi said that 3,000 gold coins and 5,000 silver coins, and that was all the savings of Milord Tamati for the entire period of his reign. Koi said that this summer had been very hot, and there had been crop failure throughout the area, and grain was now expensive. But this money should have been enough to survive the winter. Koi said that Tamati knew a lot about farming, and in previous years they usually sold surplus grain, but this time it was the other way around. Fan Li realized that there was about 4 million in money there, and he had never seen such money in his life, and with such money he would not know any worries. But first he had to take Nia to the hospital. And after that, Fan Li returned to his world, and when he started to leave the place where the construction was taking place, unexpectedly, the police were already waiting for him there. Suddenly, the inspector stopped the student and asked if he had seen a strange car covered in spikes there, and Fan Li said that he had not seen anyone there. Fan Li was holding the ball in his hands, and the inspectors were talking among themselves and said that witnesses saw that car drive into the construction site and went to check there. After this, Fan Li took Nia to the hospital, and she was immediately given the necessary help, and the next day, she began to recover in the central hospital. Nia woke up and Fan Li stood next to her and asked if she was awake and said that she had slept for a very long time and he was afraid that she would never wake up. And then Nia turned to the student and asked Mr. Fan Li what kind of place it was, because it was the first time she had seen such buildings. Fan Li approached her and asked her not to make any sudden movements and said that she had just recovered and needed rest. Fan Li placed food in front of her and she asked what smelled so good. The student explained that fortunately, her internal organs weren't damaged, and the doctor allowed her to eat some porridge. Nia was surprised and did not understand what kind of porridge it was. But after carefully trying one spoonful, she realized that it was a very tasty food. Nia started eating the porridge quickly, and Fanli asked her to be careful and said that if she kept moving like that, her stitches could come apart. Nia looked at Fan Li and said that it was very tasty and was like the food of the gods, and she had never tasted anything more delicious in her life. Nia didn't believe what was happening and asked Mr. Fan Li to tell her the truth and asked if they were dead, but the student asked her not to say stupid things. Nia said that this place was like a golden palace, and she knew that after death, people had two paths, and the gods took them with them to the golden palace. Nia said that she heard that it was just as warm there, and the sun was always shining, and there was the same pleasant atmosphere. She also heard that demons from the afterlife came for bad people, and they nailed sinners to their chariots and took them straight to hell. And then Fan Li realized that it was not surprising that the bandits mistook him for a demon from hell, and his appearance seemed to fit in well with their beliefs. Suddenly, Nia blushed and started feeling unwell. Fan Li got scared and asked her where it hurt, but Nia said she wanted to go to the bathroom. Fan Li took her there and thought that she needed to buy some clothes because she had nothing in this dimension except a hospital gown. Fan Li told her that after finishing the work, she had to press there, and all the dirty stuff would float away, and Nia said that it was some kind of miracle of technology. The student told Nia that he would be busy for the next couple of days, and he wanted to hire a sitter to take care of her while he was gone. Fan Li asked her to take her smartphone and contact him if she needed anything, and Nia didn't understand what kind of smartphone it was and how to use it. Fan Li spent the entire first half of the day learning how to use a smartphone, and after that, he went to the bank to get Tamati gold for money. After this, the worker showed Fan Li the house and said that the owners of the house had long ago emigrated abroad and were unlikely to return soon. The worker said that few people rented such huge houses, and if Fan Li built this mansion, he could count on a good discount. This huge house had all the amenities including a gym, entertainment room, home theater, and jacuzzi for complete relaxation. The worker showed the student the swimming pool in this house and said that in general this house had everything for a comfortable life, and he didn't have to worry about anything. The worker also added and said that the main thing was that there was a high fence that hid the entire perimeter of the house from prying eyes, and he could be there peacefully. Fan Li said that he liked everything and asked to inform him when he would prepare the lease agreement, and the worker agreed with him and asked him to rest for now. Fan Li lay on the hammock and thought that now it could be said that he had his own stronghold in this dimension, and that was great. Fan Li thought about it and decided to send his mother 20,000 so that their life would be easier, and he thought that a large sum could scare them. Fan Li was relaxing and thought that it was good there and understood how the rich people felt and asked the system to show his master new functions. Fan Li saw a drum that could drop 10,000 gold coins or random equipment or characteristics. Fan Li was surprised by the 10,000 gold coins and realized that it was 14 million yuan, and with that kind of money, he could live like the king of the world. But Fan Li was indignant because the probability of not getting anything was too high, and he thought why this system was so greedy and did not want to give money. Fan Li read that for one round of the treasure hunt game it was necessary to earn points, but for beginners, the first round was free and he wanted to try it. Fan Li wondered what he was waiting for and immediately began hunting and spun the drum. The student hoped to land gold coins and become rich. The student understood that the outcome of this round could change his whole life, and he could immediately turn from a poor man into a rich man and start living a good life. And then the reel stopped on a prize called a random hero, and the system congratulated the owner on this award, and the student was sorry that it was not money. Fan Li was sad, but he thought it was better than nothing. But suddenly the system notified him that an additional task was opened. He was given the task of rescuing Gavesha, a talented swordswoman from the kingdom of Varner, and she was facing a tragic end and was to be drugged in the city of tourists and killed. The goal of the mission was to save Gavesha before she was harmed, and the payoff was 35 points, while the penalty was resetting the hunt score. Fan Li thought that if he failed this task, he would be left without a prize, and not only that, in 50 cases the prize might not appear, he had to complete the task to receive it. Fan Li was very angry about this fact and thought that it was just robbery, and it was unfair because he honestly won the prize in this hunt. But then a notification appeared in the system that the owner of the system could refuse to complete the task. But in this case, his winnings would be reset to 0. Fan Li wondered if there was even a photo of the one he was looking for. Because how could he find her before tomorrow, knowing only her name, and how would that help him? And suddenly a notification appeared in the system that he could view the latest available photo of Gavacia, and a beautiful girl appeared in front of him. Fan Li was shocked by how that same Gavacia looked, because he did not expect that she was such a beauty, and he was speechless from such beauty. Fan Li thought that this was where he should have started, and now he was motivated and determined that he needed to complete this task. The student decided to get to it quickly and asked to show him a map, and a map of the area appeared in front of him, and he began to study it. Fan Li realized that this city of tourists was very close to Angelinia, and it was wonderful, and he could at the same time explore the surrounding lands. Fan Li thought that the people from that dimension considered him either a god or a demon, and Gavacia a Valkyrie, and apparently their meeting was destined by fate. And after that, in the evening, Fan Li moved all his things to the new house and began to slowly get used to this new luxurious and comfortable home. Fan Li filled the pantry with food so that he could take it at any time and transfer it to another dimension. He also bought household items and clothes for Nia. Fan Li wanted to look at Nia in this new dress because she was a very beautiful girl and was not even different from the others in this world. But the student realized that he had to remember the assignment because the beautiful life was not given to him for free, and it had to be earned. And after the preparatory activities were completed, he went into another dimension and went to the city of tourists to complete the task. And after a few hours, Fan Li was finally there and learned that Tourist was under the control of Prince Charles, the king's second son. Fan Li noticed this city and thought that Tourist looked much more impressive than Angelinia, and it seemed that the treasury of this city was larger. Fan Li went into a city cafe, and the bartender said that if he was interested in girls, then all the most beautiful girls were there, and asked if he was interested in this. Fan Li thanked him and said that he was not interested in this, and he just wanted to find out information about someone, and the bartender asked who he wanted to know about. And suddenly Fan Li heard some girl talking about how he often came to her and asked if he really came to her when Gavacia refused him. The girl said that Gavacia was the beauty of the kingdom, and he had no chance with her, and had to settle for a girl like her. The resident asked her why she was so talkative, and said that even such a noble maiden as Gavacia could be taken by force and she would not refuse him. The girl said that Gavacia was a Valkyrie, and would never stoop to his level, and the villager said that she could be tamed. Fan Li listened carefully to their conversation about Gavacia and the Valkyrie, and he had no doubt that they were talking about the object of his mission. And then suddenly a local resident came out to him and told the girl that very soon she would turn from a goddess into an ordinary girl like her and would be with him. Fan Li looked at them, and the bartender told him that it was Meyer and he was the prince's personal guard and held a fairly high position. Fan Li said that in the conversation he mentioned Gavacia, and the bartender said that she was a warrior and the prince invited her there under the pretext of helping in the fight against bandits. The student was drinking drinks, and the bartender said that during the day, Gavacia trained soldiers, and that this evening she was most likely in His Majesty's castle. Fan Li thanked the bartender for such useful information and said that he helped him a lot and left him a few coins for it. After this, Fan Li went outside and thought that he needed to start searching for Gavacia from the prince's castle, and most likely she was there. And then suddenly Fan Li noticed that Meyer was buying some strange thing from the seller, and he grinned evilly and put this thing in his pocket and left from there. And then Fan Li approached the seller and asked if he could tell him what this guard had just purchased from him. The seller smiled and asked if he also wanted to buy the same thing, and said that it was a very effective remedy and could help him a lot. The seller told Fan Li that if he had his eye on an unapproachable girl, he simply had to mix this into her food, and she would turn them into obedient girls. Fan Li now realized who exactly was causing danger to Gavacia. He thought that this guard was a real scoundrel and had no honor. Fan Li began to quietly follow this guard and followed him closely, and noticed that this guard went inside the castle and immediately disappeared there. Fan Li decided to go inside, and the defenders introduced him to the prince and said that a merchant had arrived with very interesting goods that might be of interest to him. Personal guard Meyer stood next to Prince Karl, and the prince asked his people why they let some merchant in there and whether he really gave them money for it. The castle guard smiled and told the prince that this was not so, and said that he had checked his goods, and they were indeed very interesting and of high quality. But suddenly, Prince Charles ordered his men to hang this guard. Fan Li watched all this, shocked and unable to understand what was happening. The guard shouted and asked His Majesty to forgive and pardon him, and people began to carry him away from there, grabbing him by the hands and not reacting to anything. Prince Carl asked Fan Li if he really wanted to stand there rooted to the spot and asked if he came there to sell things and told him to tell him everything. Prince Charles told Fan Li to get his goods and said that if he was not impressed with his goods, he would go after that guard. Fan Li told His Majesty that his goods would definitely not disappoint him because they were of the best quality, and he decided to start showing the goods after that. He showed the prince the sugar, and he remembered that earlier he had found out from Koi the cost of various goods, and it turned out that besides spices, sugarcane also did not grow in this area. Fan Li learned that while foreign sugar was reaching these places, it passed through the hands of a bunch of resellers, and as a result, only royalty could buy it. Prince Charles tasted this sugar and said that it was very sweet, and he had never tasted such sweet sugar in his life, and said that he would acquire it. Fan Li said that he also had mirrors, and Meyer said that these mirrors were clear, and bronze ones were rubbish in comparison, and the prince acquired a mirror too. After this, Fan Li showed the prince the soap and said that he could wash himself and his clothes with it, and that it had unrivaled cleansing properties. Prince Carl tried it and was pleased and said that his goods were to his liking, and said that if in the future something amazing falls into his hands, he will buy it. Prince Carl promised that he would be the first to buy everything for him, and Fan Li agreed with him and was glad that he had just raised another 600 coins. Prince Carl asked his guard to take the sugar to the kitchen and the mirrors and soap to Govesa, and at the same time to tell the people in the kitchen to take the dinner straight to her room. Prince Carl told Meyer that he would be having dinner with her today and asked him if he had bought what he had asked him for his personal purposes. Guard Meyer smiled slyly and said that he brought what he asked him for and said that it was a very unusual remedy. Meyer told His Majesty that she was not supposed to be his tonight, and Prince Carl asked him to hope that she would understand his actions. And then Fan Li realized that the prince himself was going to drug Govesa, but it didn't look like he was planning to harm or maim her. Prince Carl ordered all his men to leave him, and Meyer asked the guards to escort the merchant and said that he had done a great job today and they were waiting for him in the future. Fan Li started to leave from there and realized that it was already getting dark, and he needed to quickly find Govesa and take her away from there and thereby complete the task given by the system. And then suddenly Fan Li distracted the guard by asking him to look to the side and said that he saw something moving there and approaching him. And suddenly, when the guard dodged, Fan Li hit him with a stun gun and knocked him out and said that he was very naive and believed his every word. After that, Fan Li began to change into the guard's clothes and thought that there were probably many rooms in this castle and wondered how he could find Govesa there. Fan Li was wandering around the castle and suddenly smelled the smell of fried meat and realized that he had found a kitchen where many delicious dishes were being prepared. The workers asked if this was the same sugar that the prince had bought today, and she wanted to try it. But another woman said that if she did, she would end up on the gallows. And then suddenly Fan Li came up to them and shouted and asked what they were talking about, and said that the prince ordered that some fruit be brought to Govesa. The woman told him that the order would be carried out immediately, and asked if this untouchable woman was really going to meet the prince today, and her friend asked her to keep quiet so there would be no problems. The worker took a bowl of fruit and approached the room with Fan Li, asked Mrs. Govesa to open the door, and said that she had brought her fruit. Jovisha told her to come into the room, and Fan Li smiled and thought that it worked, and he could finally see her after a long wait. The worker and Fan Li entered the room, and she looked at Govesa and quickly put the fruits on the table and immediately left so as not to disturb her. Fan Li looked there and wondered if it was really a head, and at that time, Govesa was telling the great Balunshi that she was dedicating this sacrifice to him. Govesa performed the ritual and thanked him for the strength and courage that he gave her, and she wanted and will keep him for the rest of her life. And then suddenly, Govesa stopped performing the ritual and asked Fan Li what he needed, and the student was surprised how she guessed about his presence. Fan Li said that he came to tell her that the prince was planning to deal with her meanly, and that tonight he would give her an intoxicant and her dinner. Govesa said that he was his man, and asked why he decided to betray his prince and warn her about this danger. She asked if he wasn't afraid for his life because the prince could punish him for this, and Fan Li said that he wanted to help her and wasn't afraid for himself. Govesa turned around and said that she thought Fan Li was lying to her, and suddenly she grabbed him by the scruff of the neck with all her might and demanded that he tell the truth. Jovisha asked Fan Li who sent him there and why he wanted to quarrel between her and the prince, and ordered him to answer her questions immediately. She lifted Fan Li up and he said that he told her the truth, and thought that Gawaisha was very strong, and it was clear that she was a warrior. Gawaisha said that she had arrived there recently, but she trained his soldiers every day and did not remember his face and said that he was not a soldier of Charles. Gawaisha looked angrily at Fan Li and asked if he was silent and said that Bulunchi's lover would get 2 heads today if things continued like this. But Fan Li asked her to stop and said that he had come from the land of the gods, and he knew of a prophecy according to which she was supposed to die today. Gawaisha asked about the country of the gods and said that he couldn't come up with anything better and said that maybe he himself was a god, and Fan Li said that he could order this from her. And then Fan Li took out his phone and showed Gawaisha his city with tall buildings and said that this was the country of the gods from where he came to their city. Fan Li said they lived in towers that almost touched the sky. He said these were wondrous structures that could house even thousands of gods. The student said that they traveled on chariots without horses, and this was the main means of transportation for the gods who lived in this world. The student continued and said that they held feasts in luxurious halls with crystal, and all the gods had fun and danced at such events. Fan Li said that all the gods in his world enjoyed the food of the gods, and there were many different dishes for every taste, and they could choose any of them. Fan Li told Gawaisha that this was paradise, and didn't she see it? Because there were all the conditions for living in complete luxury. Fan Li continued to scroll through the photos, and suddenly he started showing Gawaisha photos of various girls who were relaxing on the beach and asked if she looked at them. Gawaisha was very surprised and asked Fan Li why he showed her photos of half-naked girls and how this was connected with his words. Fan Li looked at his phone and was very surprised by this because he thought that he had already deleted the photos from his last trip to the beach, and he was very ashamed. Gawaisha said that to tell the truth, she had never seen anything like it, and this place was very unusual and resembled paradise. Gawaisha asked Fan Li what was in his hand and how he was able to fit towers and chariots into such a small thing, because it was impossible. Fan Li said that it was very difficult to explain, and said that he would explain everything to her next time, and said that they now had to hurry to leave this place. And then suddenly Prince Carl appeared behind Fan Li and asked him who he had been talking to all this time and whether he had really been talking to Gawaisha. Fan Li greeted Prince Carl and thought that it was very bad because he did not have time to quickly leave this place and complete the task. Gawaisha approached Prince Carl and said that she was glad that he visited her and asked how she could help and be of use to Her Majesty. Prince Carl told Gawaisha that they had something to discuss today and ordered all his men to leave them there alone, and he wanted to be there only with her. Fan Li didn't want to leave there, and Meyer asked him why he stood there and didn't follow the order, and Fan Li said that it was his fault and started to leave the room. Fan Li was very angry from the fact that he was very close to success, and he did not understand what to do next, and he had no ideas. Fan Li thought about breaking into the room and finishing off the prince, but he couldn't do it because the guards would quickly grab him and send him straight to the gallows. Meyer looked at Fan Li and said that it was strange and asked if he wasn't today's merchant and why he dressed as the guardian of this tower. Fan Li smiled back at Guard Meyer and said that it was a pleasant meeting and he was very glad to see him again today. And then suddenly Meyer ordered all the people to grab him, and Fan Li quickly ran from there and realized that he had already played himself out and his mission was almost a failure. At this time, Prince Carl was having dinner in the room with Gawaisha and asked her if she was happy with his gifts, because he tried so hard for her. Gawaisha told the prince that she had chosen the path of a warrior and had given up many worldly habits, including accepting gifts, and asked him to give it to someone else. Gawaisha asked Carl what he wanted to talk to her about alone, and the prince just sat and silently watched her. And it was strange. And then Prince Carl told Gawaisha that they would talk about business later and asked her to first drink a glass of wine and relieve the tension and then get down to business. Gawaisha immediately remembered Fan Li's words about the prince planning to do something mean to her and mix an intoxicant into her dinner. And then Gawaisha began to drink wine, and Prince Carl looked at her and smiled and thought that she was smart and did everything according to his plan. At this time, Fan Li continued to run away from the guards who were trying to grab him, and he noticed that people were already waiting for him at the entrance to this tower. And then Fan Li fell into a trap, and Meyer grabbed him and said that this bastard was caught and ordered him to tell why he came to them under the guise of a merchant. Guard Meyer was interrogating Fan Li, but suddenly his man ran up behind him and said that an attempt had been made on Prince Carl's life. Meyer couldn't believe it and asked his 2 men to keep an eye on this bastard, and he told the rest to go with him to their boss. Fan Li waited for Meyer to leave and suddenly told the guards that he had 600 gold coins with him and said that if they let him go, it would all go to them. The guards looked at each other and decided that they would let Fan Li go and earn money, since they were underpaid and they could use the extra money. And then, unexpectedly, Fan Li actually gave them a bag of gold. The guards were surprised and said that he really did have a ton of gold and that they had never seen such money in their lives. The guards took the coins and thanked Fan Li for the money, but said that they could not let them go because they were not traitors. Fan Li said that if that wasn't enough for them, he had another bag of money and they could take it. But they had to let him go because he was very scared. The guards wondered where such a fool could get so much money and said that they would take the money but would not let him go, and he could talk about it with Meyer. Fan Li actually hid a stun gun in his bag, and when the guards wanted to take the bag from his hands, he turned on the stun gun and the guards were immediately electrocuted. The other guard was shocked by this and asked Fan Li what he did to his colleague, but suddenly Fan Li quickly approached him and said that he would soon understand everything himself. Fan Li wanted to attack the guard, but he wanted to defend himself with his sword, and then he too was struck by electricity, and he passed out from this and fell to the ground. Fan Li thought that these guards were naive idiots and thought that everything in life was so easy for them and believed his words about wealth. At that moment, Gavisha stood on the roof of the tower, sword in hand, surrounded by guards. Meyer asked her why she had killed Karl, since he had treated her well. Gavisha said that this two-faced scoundrel deserved to die, and said that if any of them wanted to go to him, she could arrange it for them in a moment. Meyer asked his people what they were waiting for, and said that Gavisha had killed their prince and had confessed to it herself and ordered them to finish her off. Gavisha started fighting the guards and she was very strong and gave them an equal fight and took out several people in a matter of seconds. Fan Li watched all this and thought that it was cool, and his warrior was a very brave and technical woman who could stand up for herself. And then suddenly Gavisha felt a strange sensation and did not understand what was happening to her, because some unknown force was weakening her will. Gavisha thought it was strange because she couldn't even hold a sword in her hands properly, and wondered if the gods were no longer patronizing her. Meyer now ordered everyone to attack Gavisha together, and said that the warrior had been affected by a drug and was unable to defend herself. Meyer ordered his men to go only forward, and the guards began to move towards her with spears, and Gavisha did not know what to do with them. Gavisha wondered if she was really destined to die so ingloriously at the hands of some guards, since she considered it a disgrace because she had been in serious massacres. She told Balunshi that she had honored him all her life, and that she had sacrificed many lives, and asked him to take her too to the land of the gods and jumped from the roof. Fan Li looked at all this and thought that he had come all this way to save her. But she decided to do this and thought what would happen to his task now. Fan Li wondered what he could do, because he couldn't just stand there and watch Gavisha fall to the ground and break. Fan Li quickly pulled out his orb and opened a portal. The student thought that if he could somehow reverse this hole, he might be able to save the warrior. And suddenly he somehow managed to do it. And Fan Li was surprised that it was actually possible to turn her, and realized that now she would be saved. And then Fan Li jumped into the portal and suddenly he came across his apocalypse machine and thought that he had completely forgotten about this thing. Fan Li did not lose his composure and immediately untied his hands and immediately closed the portal and began to think about further actions and a rescue plan. Gavisha immediately froze in place because Fan Li closed the portal, and in this dimension, time stopped and she had not yet reached the ground. Fan Li thought that she jumped from a height of no more than 10 meters, and considering the speed she developed during the fall, the length of the pool should have been enough for landing. Fan Li said welcome to the land of the gods to his warrior, and immediately he opened a portal in front of the pool and Gavisha fell right into the pool. Fan Li looked at Gavisha as she fell into the water and realized she was unconscious. He was surprised when she had managed to lose consciousness. Fan Li began to pull Gavisha out of the water and thought she couldn't have lost consciousness after falling into the water because the blow wasn't that strong. Meyer looked at the portal and wondered what it was because he saw Gavisha fall right into this glowing circle and immediately disappear from there. The guards were shocked and said, could it be that Gavisha really was a goddess, and now Balunshi took her to the land of the gods because she was a brave warrior? At this time, Fan Li laid Gavisha on the bed and began to wipe her body so that she would not catch a cold, and he thought that he did not do this out of lustful motives. Fan Li realized that her clothes were also completely wet and she had to change, but he couldn't do that because he was a good person. And then suddenly Gavesha began to wake up, and Fan Li smiled and said that it was great that she woke up and said that she could dry herself. But suddenly, Gavesha grabbed Fan Li by the scruff of the neck and pulled him towards her, and said that she wanted to play with him right now, and did not want to wait a second. Fan Li was surprised and wondered what kind of medicine they had given her, and realized that this was the reason she was behaving this way, and it was strange. Fan Li thought that he couldn't do this because he was a decent and good person, and couldn't take advantage of her in such a state. Fan Li immediately pushed Gavesha away, and said that her body needed detoxification, and he went to look for something in his medicine cabinet. But suddenly Fan Li realized that he could not move, and when he remembered this evening, he was always amazed at his naivety, because he treated her like an ordinary girl. Fan Li realized that this was his fatal mistake, and he did not take into account the fact that she was a real warrior who terrified men. But suddenly Gavesha threw the student to the ground, and Fan Li asked what she was doing, because he was in pain, and she said that he would not go anywhere today. After that, Fan Li remembered the previous night, and realized that before he thought that life consisted of nothing but humiliation, and yesterday, thanks to Gavesha, he realized that this was not so. He realized that the time had come to realize that despite all the difficulties of the past, he had finally reached real life, and this life was wonderful. The next day, Gavesha looked out the window onto the street and saw a man ordering food and all the people driving their cars. Gavesha immediately thought about what kind of amazing place it was, and although it was full of wonders, she realized that it was definitely not the land of the gods. Gavesha realized that on the land of the gods the souls of heroes did not bleed, and last night she broke her oath as a warrior, and that was very bad. Gavesha realized that this meant that this sin could only be washed away by finishing off her first man and then herself, and then everything would be fine. And then suddenly Gavesha took out her sword and she brought it to Fan Li's throat and said that yesterday's events happened only because of her fault. Gavesha said that she herself should bear responsibility for this, and immediately swung with all her might to deliver the finishing blow. But suddenly at that moment, not only Fan Li's phone received a message from his mother, but Gavesha heard it and immediately froze in surprise. Gavesha looked at the student's phone and remembered that it was the same magical thing in which Fan Li kept the towers and chariots. And then Gavesha clicked on the message and suddenly heard Fan Li's mother saying that he was an asshole and asking where he got the money from and whether he had done anything illegal. Fan Li's mother said that she was busy these days, but when she was free, she said that she would come to him right away and asked what he did after school. Gavesha did not understand what kind of language it was, and judging by the tone, she realized that it was as if she was being scolded, and it was an inexplicable technique that was difficult to understand. She thought that this thing realized that Fan Li was in danger and began to read the spell, but she didn't care, and she broke the oath and wanted to atone for the sin with blood. Gavesha swung her arms and now she definitely wanted to finish off Fan Li, but suddenly at that moment, Nia called him via video chat and Gavesha immediately stopped. And then Fan Li woke up and was surprised that Nia called him and suddenly noticed that Gavesha grabbed him by the neck and held a sword in her hand, and he did not understand what was happening there. Gavesha said that he woke up at the right time and asked what kind of place it was and how they ended up there, and said that he didn't have to talk about the land of the gods because she knew it was a lie. Fan Li asked Gavesha to calm down and said that she squeezed him so much that he couldn't even breathe, and she let him go and told him to answer questions. Fan Li came to his senses and thought that it was the woman's people, because only yesterday they were having a nice time and loving each other, and today she already wanted to finish him off. Fan Li recounted the events of yesterday as best he could and explained to Gavesha that everything that seemed like a wormhole was magic. Fan Li said that last night everything happened against his will, and she didn't have to worry because he acted like a decent man towards her. Gavesha became very angry remembering these events and immediately swung her sword and wanted to finish off the student, but Fan Li asked to spare him because he was not to blame. Gavesha immediately threw her sword on the floor and began to cry. Fan Li asked her not to cry and said that he was very afraid of women's tears. Gavesha told Fan Li that from childhood she was taught to train and believe in the warrior god Bulunshi, and she did this all her life. Thanks to her strong faith, Gavesha received patronage from above, and on the battlefield she was invincible, and in her entire life she was never even wounded. But having chosen the path of a warrior, she had to renounce worldly pleasures and preserve her honor, and for breaking her oath she was destined to go to hell forever. Gavesha said that apparently hell would become her refuge, and told Fan Li that it was not his fault because she herself was to blame for these problems. Fan Li thought about how many superstitions were in her head, and he wanted to wean her off worshipping these gods, and told her that to lift her spirits, she needed to eat well. Fan Li asked Gawaisha to go with him, and said that he would first show her how to use the shower, and then feed her a hearty breakfast. Gawaisha was taking a shower, and she felt very good. She would never have thought that washing could be so pleasant, because she didn't want to get out. Gawaisha thought that now even hell didn't seem particularly strange to her, and suddenly she wondered what she was thinking about, because even thinking about such a thing was a grave sin. Fan Li told Gawaisha that her clothes needed to be washed, and he prepared fresh clothes for her and asked her to wear these clothes after the shower, which he actually bought for Nia. After that, Fan Li was preparing breakfast in the kitchen, and Nia asked Mr. Fan Li why he didn't accept her challenge, and the student said that he was just busy. Nia said that people in white coats came to her. But there was also good news. She ate 3 times a day yesterday, and everything was delicious, and this place was a real paradise. Fan Li said that she didn't have to worry about the doctors, and asked Nia to continue to recover and that he would visit her tomorrow and bring her clothes. And then suddenly, Gawaisha appeared behind the student and realized his name was Fan Li. The student was very surprised by this, and in his excitement, didn't realize what he was doing. Nia also saw Gawaisha and said she was a real beauty. Fan Li too was speechless and said goodbye to Nia. Nia asked Fan Li who she was, but the student quickly ended the call and said that he would call her back later and would definitely tell her everything. Fan Li looked at Gawaisha and asked if she liked the shower and how she felt after it, and immediately the student's nose started bleeding. Gawaisha stood in front of Fan Li in the clothes he had prepared for her and asked the student if all their clothes were really that revealing. Gawaisha said that she did not like these clothes because she remained almost naked in these strange clothes of the inhabitants of this world. Fan Li became very nervous and said that these were home clothes and everyone wore such clothes and asked Gawaisha to get used to it. Fan Li imagined that if Nia and Gawaisha always walked around the house dressed like that, he would become the happiest person on the planet, and he was ready to burst from the thought. Fan Li smiled at Gawaisha and asked her to sit down and said that she had not eaten anything for a long time and she needed to refresh herself and maintain her strength. Fan Li realized that after a hot shower, Gawaisha had noticeably relaxed, and this was also facilitated by the pleasant melody that was playing. Gawaisha sat and ate a steak, and Gawaisha, accustomed to life in Spartan conditions, was amazed by new pleasures because she never thought that life could be so pleasant. And then a system appeared in front of Fan Li, and he noticed that the task had not yet been completed, and he thought that apparently, in order to complete the task, he needed to take Gawaisha out of Turis. But Fan Li was not clear what Gawaisha's devotion meant and whether it meant that she would be devoted to him regardless of any circumstances. And then Fan Li read that after completing the task, the system will, using hypnosis, implant in the hero's subconscious the need to follow the owner's orders. Side effects included the possibility of partial loss of the hero's personality and damage to her brain. But the owner had the right to refuse the implantation of loyalty. But by refusing to implement loyalty, the owner would forever lose this opportunity, and the hero's behavior would depend on his will, and the system would not influence him. Fan Li thought that these were side effects, but he didn't want Gawaisha to lose her personality and become mentally retarded. Fan Li told Gawaisha that they would rest there for a while and then return to her world, and asked if they got out of Turis what she wanted to do next. Gawaisha continued eating the steak and said that after what she did to the prince, she would definitely not be welcome in the kingdom of Varner, and it would be dangerous there. Gawaisha said that she would probably have to run away from there under a false name and spend the rest of her life there. Fan Li asked Gawaisha if she had considered staying with him and said that after what had happened between them, he was supposed to take responsibility for her. Fan Li told Gawaisha that he had a bunch of stupid people in Angelinia who didn't know how to handle weapons, and if she agreed to train them, he would be very happy. Gawaisha said that whoever betrayed the oath given to the gods would be cursed, and sooner or later, heavenly punishment would overtake her, and her presence would only bring trouble upon them. Gawaisha's mood suddenly dropped, and she said that a place in hell was already prepared for her, and said that this was her fate that could not be changed. Fan Li said to hell with such fate, and said that she was never injured only because she trained hard, and the protection of the gods had nothing to do with it. Fan Li asked her to go with him, and said that he would show her their city, which was built by people only through intelligence and labor, without any gods. Fan Li told her that many people were atheists like himself, and they achieved success through hard work and not with the help of some bulunshi. And after that, Fan Li and Gavesha walked around the city together, and the student promised her that he would show her all the interesting places in their city, and they would visit everything today. And right up until the evening, Fan Li took Gavesha to the most interesting places in the city, and he bought her ice cream and they visited the cinema. In the evening, they went to the hospital, and Nia asked Gavesha if she was really that Valkyrie, and said that she had idolized her all her life. Nia said that she often heard songs written about Gavesha, and she always wanted to be like her, and she was a role model and a holy woman. Gavesha asked Nia not to exaggerate and said that she was an ordinary girl and there was more holiness in Nia than in her, but she fought well. Nia listened to Gavesha's words and asked Fan Li to come to her. The student asked her what she wanted him to do for her. Nia asked Fan Li why he didn't tell her right away that it was Gavesha, since she had already imagined it. The student asked what she meant. Nia said that everyone knew that Gavesha was the chosen one of the gods and had to remain chaste, and if she violated this, she would have to wash away the sin with blood. Nia said that if they were both alive and well, it meant that nothing happened between them, because in the morning at first she thought that he had a new girlfriend. Nia thought that Fan Li didn't need her anymore, and she was glad that she was wrong. But at least Gavesha's morning outfit looked at least strange. Fan Li looked at Gavesha and thought that in fact she had not only broken her oath last night, but had continued to break it until the morning. After that, they said goodbye to Nia and went down to the garage and got into Fan Li's car. The student told Gavesha that it was time to return her. After spending the whole day with her, Fan Li discovered that behind the mask of a cruel and independent warrior hid a simple and kind girl. Fan Li realized that Gavesha happily accepted affection and care, and that at such a difficult moment in her life, she was simply looking for support. But the reality in which she lived all her life required her to hide her gentle nature, because she constantly had to bravely cope with the challenges of fate herself. Fan Li thought that since she had her own path, it was better to let her go, but he did not want to part with her, since over these days he had become very accustomed to her. Fan Li thought that he could not take advantage of the system's capabilities and subjugate it to himself, because this was not his method, and suddenly Gavesha turned to him. Gavesha looked at the student and said thank you for everything he did for her today, and said that she had never felt so good. And after that, Fan Li opened a portal and asked Gavesha if she was ready, and she agreed with him, and the student immediately stepped on the gas, and they drove into this portal. Meyer and his men suddenly saw a car appear in that place, and could not understand what it was and froze in surprise. Fan Li closed the portal, and when he looked at the roof, he saw no one there and it was strange, and after that, he quickly left from there with Gavesha. The guards hid on the roof and told Meyer that the people were telling the truth, and Gavesha was a Valkyrie, and she had a connection with the other world. Another guard said that they were demons, and asked them not to take him to hell, and swore to be a good person for the rest of his life, and begged them not to come for him. And then Meyer ordered his man to look at what was happening there, and said that otherwise he would immediately kill him for not following orders. The guard looked over and told Meyer that there was no one there, no chariot, no glowing circle, and everything had disappeared. Meyer didn't understand what was happening there. At this time, Fan Li was leaving from there and was surprised why they did not chase after them, because when he was figuring out the possible development of events, he thought that it would be more difficult to get away from them. And then suddenly a system appeared in front of Fan Li, where it was said that the task to save Gavesha was completed, and he received the reward of loyalty to Gavesha. And suddenly a notification came that in 10 seconds, the system would carry out the operation to introduce loyalty automatically without the owner's consent. Fan Li looked at this and thought that in fact he really wanted to keep Gavesha next to him, and the thought of her leaving made him sad. Fan Li thought about what he should do, because if he did nothing, then in a few moments the system would automatically bind her to him forever. There were 2 seconds left, and Fan Li thought he should take this change as a game and maybe let everything go and see what happens next. And when there was 1 second left, Fan Li shouted and canceled the implementation, and the system notified him that the owner refused the reward of loyalty to Gavesha. Fan Li exhaled, and Gavesha asked if he was okay and what had just happened to him. Fan Li told her not to worry and said that everything was fine. Fan Li wondered what he was thinking about, because of his selfish desires, he had just turned a living person into a weak-willed vegetable. Fan Li stopped, and Gavesha said that there was a horse breeder nearby who looked after her warhorse, and she thought it was time for them to part ways. Gavesha said goodbye to Fan Li and said that she would never forget what he did for her, and suddenly Fan Li asked her not to leave. Fan Li handed her a gift, and she asked what it was. Fan Li said it was just a knife and asked her to take it as a souvenir and reminder of him. Fan Li said that he would be in Angelinia and told Gavacia that if she was passing by, she could look in on him and he would be happy to receive her. Gavacia smiled and left. Fan Li wondered if they would ever meet again in this backward world without advanced means of communication. The student was very sad that he lost a girl like Gavacia, and after breaking up with Gavacia, Fan Li went to Angelinia alone. At this time, the traitor mercenary walked with his people, and he was offended, and he said that by this time he should have already become the Lord of Angelinia. The mercenary was angry that his grandiose plans had failed because of some brat, and he said that he would soon return everything to him with interest. And then suddenly the man asked his leader to look at something and asked whose tracks these were, and said that it was the chariot of a demon. The head of the mercenaries told him not to talk nonsense, and said that the brat was not a demon, and he himself saw how blood flowed from him, and he was even wounded. The man said that the tracks were very fresh, and the mercenary asked him to follow him, and said that now they would find answers to all the questions, and everything would become clear to them. The traitor mercenary wanted to see if this brat could pull off some trick this time and surprise them, because this time they were ready for anything. At this time, Fan Li was pushing his car with all his might, but it did not want to move anywhere, and the student realized that this was a huge problem. Fan Li realized that troubles never came alone, and he first broke up with the beauty, and now he got stuck in the mud, and it was an unpleasant surprise. And then suddenly Fan Li heard a voice and realized that it was a vile laugh, and he had heard this laugh somewhere before, and the student froze in surprise. And then that same traitor mercenary appeared in front of Fan Li and greeted the demon and said that that time he almost tricked him, and he even believed it. The head of the mercenaries smiled at the student and said that his performance was over, and now he would pay for everything he had done to them earlier and get what he deserved. And when Fan Li turned around, two big guys were already standing in front of him, and the mercenary asked if he really wanted to escape and said that he was unlikely to succeed. And then Fan Li climbed into the car, and the mercenary ordered everyone to pull him out of there and said that his chariot was stuck in the mud and they were not in any danger. All the mercenaries approached the car and started hitting it with all their might, and the mercenary told the boss that it was made of metal and they couldn't break it, and he suggested setting it on fire. And then suddenly the mercenaries set fire to Fan Li's car, and the student thought why he had to go through all this headache because he could have just been relaxing in his own world. Fan Li sat inside and thought that it seemed to him that his life had only changed for the better, but he was wrong and made hasty conclusions. Fan Li thought that after the decision to let Gavacia go, everything did not go as he planned, and he remembered and took out a round ball to open a portal. Fan Li quickly opened the portal and thought that now he would have to leave there in disgrace, and he didn't even know if he would be able to return there. And then suddenly Gavacia started riding there on a horse, and all the mercenaries were surprised and asked who she was and why she was heading there. Gavacia began to destroy all the mercenaries, and they began to run away from there to save their lives. And Gavacia approached the car and called Fan Li. Fan Li just wanted to enter the portal and quickly leave from there. But suddenly he stopped and wondered if it was really Gavacia's voice and if she had returned for him. And then mercenaries with spears stood in front of Gavacia and told her not to approach them, but she quickly dealt with them and headed to the car. The head of the mercenaries looked at all this and realized that it was a Valkyrie from the kingdom of Varner, and thought about what she was doing there and what she needed. Jawisha helped Fan Li out of the car and asked if he was okay, and the student said that he thought she was already far away from there and he was glad to see her. The traitor mercenary looked at them and wondered who this brat was in the end, and why the Valkyrie herself came to save him, and where she knew him from. The head of the mercenaries realized that the brat had once again managed to escape death, since it was better for their little gang not to mess with the great Valkyrie. The head of the mercenaries told Fan Li that if they knew that he was a friend of the warrior Gavacia, they would never dare to touch him, and he regretted that everything turned out this way. The traitor mercenary asked to be heard and said that Mr. Fan Li was alive and well, and that several of his men had paid with their lives for the inconvenience caused. The head of the mercenaries asked Gavacia to forget about all this, and said that it would be good if they parted in peace and lived their lives in harmony. But Gavacia did not want to listen to his false words and immediately tied up all the mercenaries in this forest and quickly left there with Fan Li. The head of the mercenaries cried and begged for help and said that they were not guilty of anything, but no one listened to them and they were alone in the forest. But suddenly the mercenaries heard some voices and glances from the forest and asked the chief to look at this place because they saw some silhouette. And then suddenly wolves started coming out to the mercenaries, and the leader, the traitor, started praying to God for strength and said that it looked like the end had come for them. At this time, Fan Li told Gawaisha that she never told him why she returned there and asked if she was really unable to part with him. Gawaisha said she only returned to him to return the knife. Fan Li was very surprised by this answer and waited for an explanation from her. Gawaisha said that this knife looked like a real treasure and was probably worth half the city, and she could not accept such a valuable gift. Fan Li was surprised and thought about what she was talking about because he bought this knife in an ordinary army store for several tens of yuan, and it was a cheap knife. Although the modern level of manufacturing was clearly something from the realm of fantasy for them, it was no surprise that an ordinary knife seemed like a wonder of the world to them. Fan Li thought he'd bought the knife specifically for her and said it wouldn't do. Gawaisha was surprised and asked what he'd told her. Fan Li said that in their world it was considered an insult if a gift was returned, and he was also plagued by bad luck for a long time. Fan Li said that he was still thinking about how he managed to stumble upon his enemies in the middle of the wasteland, and now it all became clear to him why it happened. Gawaisha said that he had told her that he was an atheist and didn't believe in any superstitions. Fan Li said that was the reason, not superstition. Gawaisha said that if this was so, then he left her no choice. But if she accepted his gift, she would feel awkward because it was so expensive. Fan Li said that he would ask her for something later because a generous payment was due for the warrior's services, and she asked what he wanted to tell her. And then suddenly Fan Li pressed himself against Gawaisha and said that he just wanted her to stay with him forever and never go anywhere else. Gawaisha said that she couldn't do it, and Fan Li asked if she would really allow him to break into failure again after he had already almost been killed. Gawaisha said that it was impossible to argue with him, and Fan Li said that he was telling the truth because next time they could finish him off. Gawaisha asked him to know that one day she would still have to leave him, and when that moment came, she wanted him not to ask her to stay. Fan Li asked if she really agreed, and immediately hugged Gawaisha with all his might and said that he was very happy, and it was great, and there was no one happier than him. Gawaisha asked why he pressed himself so tightly against her, because he was squeezing everything on her, and Fan Li said that it was his first time riding a horse, and he was holding on to whatever he could. At this time, the inhabitants of Angelinia were working tirelessly, and the earth was ablaze, and they noticed that the head of Fan Li was approaching them along with some girl. The residents were very happy and shouted that their lord had returned and said that now everything would be different, and began to inform all the residents about this. Hoya approached the lord and said that he was glad that he had returned, and Fan Li ordered Hoya to take all the men and more carts because it was necessary to deliver grain to Angelinia. Hoya was surprised and asked where this grain was, and Fan Li asked him to follow him, and suddenly the leader showed them a huge supply of grain. The residents opened the sacks and said that there really was grain there, and that it was great, and now they didn't have to worry about winter supplies and could live decently. Hoya was very surprised and asked the Lord how he had delivered so much grain there, and Fan Li said that he could consider that he had done it with God's help. Fan Li remembered that 2 hours ago, he and Gawaisha went to the food warehouse to wholesale rice and field crops. Fan Li said he'd take everything there was and asked how much it would cost. The seller said there were 6 tons of wheat and barley, and the total cost was 45,000 yuan. Fan Li said that he would also take the pallets. The seller was surprised and said that he would give it all away for 500 yuan, since he was a very generous buyer. Fan Li transferred 45,500 yuan to the seller's account, and he asked where it all needed to be taken and said that he would organize the delivery himself. Fan Li said that they didn't need delivery and asked to leave them there, and said that they would call him when they finished with their business and asked not to enter there under any circumstances. The seller was surprised and wondered what they were going to do there, and besides, they were dressed strangely, and he thought that he didn't care about it because he had already received money for the goods. Fan Li opened a portal and told Gawaisha that now all they had to do was move everything to another world, and the inhabitants would no longer have to worry about hunger. But suddenly Gawaisha picked up the bag, and Fan Li was very surprised and asked what she was doing because there were 24 tons of grain in there, and asked to put the bag back. Fan Li smiled and asked Gawaisha if she was really going to carry all these bags herself, and Gawaisha asked what else they could do. And then Fan Li got into the car and began hauling the bags through the portal. Gawaisha was surprised that this task could have been so easy. And after a few hours, there was nothing left in the warehouse, and Gawaisha told Fan Li that he didn't even break a sweat, and it was a very convenient thing. Fan Li smiled and said that it was not for nothing that it was said that science and technology were the main productive forces of society, and that was cool. Fan Li said that they had loaded the bags and it was time for them to return, and he thought that it was worth giving Hoya credit for not asking him about this grain. Javacia still hadn't shown her face, and Fan Li thought that Angelina was very close to tourists, and it made sense to hide her identity for as long as possible. And when Lord Fan Li returned to Angelina, some of the peasants began to build a large new barn to accommodate all the grain that my lord brought them. Other residents went to cultivate the land to prepare it for sowing winter wheat and did not ask other people for any help. There was a lot of work, and due to a shortage of workers, they even had to employ captured robbers and mercenaries who were sitting in prison. Everyone was busy with something except Fan Li, and now he understood the life of a lord because he had to watch how the peasants worked hard, and this was a rotten political system. But Fan Li realized that being a lord was nice, but now was not the time to relax, and he needed to think about how he could help these people. And then Fan Li called Hoi and asked to walk through their lands together, and Hoi said that he was glad to help the lord and was already approaching him. Fan Li said that strong agriculture was the basis for the development of the state, and my lord suggested that Hoi first inspect the fields and watch the residents at work. Koi said that before the onset of winter, they would plant wheat and rye there so that they could harvest the following summer. And then the worker told his people that the Lord had come there and told everyone to work harder if they didn't want him to send them straight to hell. Fan Li smiled and thought that his brilliant appearance on the devil chariot was still fresh in their memories, and it was great because they worked harder. After that, they came to another land, and Fan Li asked why they didn't plant anything there, and Hoya said that it was a fallow field, and the wheat was sucking the strength out of the land. Koi said that if wheat were planted in the same plot for several years in a row, the soil would become impoverished, and at some point there would simply be no harvest. Therefore, they divided all their fields into two parts and used them alternately, and when weeds began to grow on the empty area, they let the cattle in there. Fan Li realized that this was called a two-field farming system, and in the same year, half of the land was cultivated and the other half was left fallow, and this was smart. But Koi said that even this system did not help them, and every year they collected less and less harvest, and this was a headache for Lord Tamati. But suddenly Fan Li asked Hoya if he knew that this problem was now easily solved, and Hoya was surprised and asked the milord what he was proposing. Fan Li asked Hoya if he had ever heard of natural fertilizers, but Hoya said that he was not familiar with this information and that it was the first time he heard about it. Fan Li said that by growing legumes, the soil's fertility could be restored naturally. Hoya said they planted beans, but he didn't know about it. Fan Li explained that nitrogen was an important chemical element for soil restoration, and that similar fertilizers were obtained from green plants called green manure. Hoya heard about nitrogen bacteria and green manure, and told my lord that he had to confess, and said that he did not understand at all what he was saying. Fan Li said that they now had a lot of grain, and they could allocate part of the reserves for some agricultural experiments. And if they increase the productivity of their lands, then the peasants will begin to live more comfortably and will begin to have more children, and then they will have enough workers. Fan Li said that people freed from land work could create something new, and the peasants did not have to kill themselves in the fields from dawn to dusk. Hoya thought that although he didn't understand most of what he was saying, the leader's speech was filled with zeal and strength and carried hope for a better future. Fan Li asked where they had stopped and said that in addition to nitrogen, they would also need phosphorus and potassium, and this mixture was supposed to fertilize the soil. Fan Li said that phosphorus could be obtained from animal bones and eggshells, and potassium was found in plant ash. Fan Li said that in general he instructed Hoya to resolve the issue with fertilizers, and Hoya said that he understood my lord and would fulfill all his demands. Fan Li thought that he could just buy bags of ready-made fertilizers and transport them there, but he was too lazy to travel between worlds every time. And then suddenly a system appeared in front of Fan Li and notified him that he had been awarded 30 points for modernizing agriculture. Fan Li was surprised by this and wondered if he was really given points for helping, and that getting points for spreading knowledge was better than completing deadly tasks. The student realized that knowledge was power, and he still had so much knowledge that would be a real revelation for them and would help them a lot. Fan Li asked Hui if he knew they could improve the two-field system. Hui was surprised and asked how they could do that. Fan Li said that they would divide the land into 3 parts and sow in the spring and fall, and on the third part of the land, they could grow grass to feed the cattle. He said that by using fertilizers and manure, they could maintain the fertility of the land, and by growing grass, they could increase the number of livestock. Koi said that now he understood everything and said that it sounds very simple, and if all this works in practice, then they could forget about the problem of hunger forever. And then suddenly the system awarded him another 30 points for modernizing agriculture, and Fan Li realized that it worked again. But Koi said that now they needed to build a barn and sow winter wheat, and if they allocated people for his reforms, they would not have enough hands. Fan Li thought for a moment and asked if they had good carpenters and blacksmiths in Angelinia. Hoya said that to forge iron, they went to the blacksmiths in the city. Koi said that they didn't have their own blacksmiths, but they had good carpenters, and Koi asked the Lord if it was necessary to call them there. Fan Li asked to call them there and said that he would solve the problem with the blacksmiths, and he had an idea for creating a revolutionary invention to increase labor. Hoya said that he couldn't wait to see his miracle invention and said that he would now go for the carpenters, and he hadn't felt such inspiration for a long time. And suddenly at that moment they heard a voice asking them not to take it. And Koi said that it was raiders. The robber took all the bags from the woman, and she asked him not to do this, and said that there was grain for her whole family, but he took the bags from her and told her to shut up. Koi said that small gangs of robbers would come to Angelinia time after time, and they would steal something or kill someone and run away from there, and there was no escape from them. And then suddenly one girl looked at Fan Li and rushed towards him with all her speed, and the raiders asked her what she was doing. The girl quickly ran to him and Hoya asked him to be careful, but the girl pushed him away and hit the milord in the face with a log and he passed out. The girl grabbed Fan Li and dragged him away on a horse. Her accomplices begged her to get out of there quickly and said that his men would soon be chasing them. But suddenly Gavatia appeared behind them and threw a spear a long distance and hit one of the mercenaries who was far from her. The mercenaries were surprised who could throw a spear such a distance, and what kind of inhuman strength it was that they had never seen before. Gavaisha immediately galloped after them, and the mercenaries turned around and said that the pursuer had high speed, and this thoroughbred horse would soon catch up with them. One of the mercenaries wanted to stop Gavaisha and stood in her way, but she immediately dealt with him and continued pursuing her without slowing down. The mercenary girl immediately grabbed Fan Li and hid with him behind a tree, holding a sword at his throat while Gavaisha ran in front of them. After that, at night the girl tied up Fan Li, and he asked to let him go and said that he could pay her for freedom with either gold or grain. Fan Li asked if she needed something else and said that he could get anything, but she remained silent, and the student wondered what she needed from him. And suddenly a system appeared in front of Fan Li, where there was a new quest, where it was said that a small group of bandits had settled to the east of Angelinia, and with their raids they disturbed the peasants, and he needed to destroy them, and he had a huge amount of time to complete the task. Fan Li thought that at least he wouldn't have to die for failure, and he wondered what kind of reward the evolutionary controller was. Fan Li was sorry that the quest appeared when he was bound by voodoo. With the help of Gavaisha and the peasants, they would have been able to deal with the bandits without any problems. Fan Li realized that he needed to get out of there, and having found a small stone, he began to cut the rope, and then suddenly a girl appeared in front of him and did not let him do it. Fan Li asked if she could speak and said that he thought she was mute and told her to move her leg and said that she was not his type. The girl asked if he was really that bold and said that it was not a problem and said that very soon he would sing differently. The girl pointed a gun at him and told him to go and find her food and said that if he tried to escape, she would gouge out his eyes. Fan Li had to obey, and he tried his best to get some food both in the forest and in the lake, but he was not very successful. And then suddenly, Fan Li noticed a hare and told her to be quiet if she wanted to eat meat because she could scare the hare away. Fan Li approached the hare and suddenly, making a sharp movement, he got out of her captivity and quickly ran away from there, and she asked if he really thought of joking with her. The girl started chasing after him and said that he was finished, but Fan Li asked if she really hoped to catch up with him on bare feet. Fan Li quickly ran out of there and suddenly noticed that there was a dead end and thought why he was always so unlucky, and the girl was approaching him. And then suddenly Fan Li noticed a cave and quickly ran there because he realized that this was his only way if he didn't want to get caught. The mercenary entered this cave and told Fan Li to stop hiding and said that she would still find him and he would pay for this act. Fan Li threw a stone in the other direction and she ran there, and the student thought that she was a fool and would never catch it. But suddenly the ground beneath his feet gave way and he fell down. The girl ran after him, but she too fell down next to him. After this, the girl stood on Fan Li's shoulders and asked him not to shake and said that all this happened because of him and they would die there. Fan Li asked why it happened because of him and asked who kidnapped him, and the girl almost got out of there, but suddenly she fell on him. The girl said that this rock was too loose and asked how they could climb there, and they wondered how to get out of there. And so they were stuck in this dark corner of the cave and no longer understood how much time had passed. But they still couldn't get out, and both were hungry and tired. The girl told Fan Li that she was thirsty, but he said that there was no water at all, and she suddenly said that she would drink his blood. But suddenly Fan Li asked her to stop and said that he knew a way to get out of there, and she asked him not to waste time and said that she would finish him off. Fan Li said he was telling her the truth. The girl said that if he did anything else, he would regret it, and suddenly a portal opened before them. The girl was very surprised and did not understand what it was, but Fan Li said that he would explain everything to her later and asked her to follow him. They passed through the portal and the girl asked what kind of place it was, and Fan Li noticed that they were suddenly in some kind of restaurant. The girl asked where he took her, and Fan Li remembered that they were walking with Gavesha, and he told her that the deed was done and he would take her to eat. And suddenly the girl started walking up to everyone and eating their food straight from their plates. They were outraged and asked who she was. She approached the guys, and they asked if her mother hadn't taught her that taking someone else's things was bad, but she suddenly hit their table with her sword. Customers begged the manager to call the police immediately and began to quickly leave the restaurant. The woman began calling the police. And then suddenly Fan Li came up to her and told her that he wanted to place an order, and he also asked her to help him untie the ropes. And the police quickly arrived and took the girl to the station. Everyone who visited said she was crazy and violent. Fan Li was eating at the time and wondered if he would get into trouble for her being taken away by the police, but he realized that it was her own fault. Fan Li thought that the police would not understand anything and thought that now he needed to think about how to get out of this cave. Fan Li took a ladder with him to another dimension, and when he started to climb out from there, he suddenly noticed something interesting. He picked up a stone and realized that it was coal, and he hit the jackpot, and it was very easy to mine coal there. And besides, it would be useful to the peasants. And suddenly the system appeared in front of him and congratulated him on the fact that he destroyed the bandits and received the Evolutionary Controller Award and 35 points. Fan Li was surprised why the task was completed because he did nothing and he didn't even know where this gang was. He wondered if the two who had been killed by Gavesha and his kidnapper were part of this gang and that by getting rid of them, they had completed the task. And then Fan Li wanted to check out the Evolutionary Controller's reward, and suddenly earthly time and a rewind button appeared in front of him. Fan Li wondered if it was a player and there were movies on it, and he pressed play and the time started to tick, but nothing happened. Fan Li stood there for half an hour but nothing happened, and he decided to press rewind, and suddenly he came to his senses and decided to press pause. Fan Li stood in shock and thought that if he understood everything correctly, then he had just made a huge mistake out of stupidity without thinking about it. After this, Fan Li returned to his dimension and, opening his laptop, realized that this was unthinkable because time had actually been rewound. Fan Li thought that the Tenmo era apparently referred to time in that dimension, and it turned out that he could control time in both dimensions. Fan Li sat and thought about everything, and thought about what he got himself into, without thinking about what he was doing in this dimension and what it led to. And then suddenly, his mother called him and asked where he had been for a whole month because he had not answered the phone and had not shown up at the dorm, and she was very worried about him.